Dobro večer, good evening. Today is with us Mark Fisher from London. He's probably the most known for his book, also translated in Croatian, Capitalist Realism, and also for his famous blog, K-Punk. This is the second lecture this year in our series in the Center for Drama Art, the Methodologies of Valorization. There will be 2 more lectures tomorrow, like Owen Heatherly and Douglas Murphy, and also 3 more in December. Mark will talk about the political aesthetics of post-capitalism. We'll talk for, let's say, 40 minutes, and then after his talk you can ask questions first. So Mark, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. Okay, I'm going to start with a clip from a BBC television programme, Have I Got News For You? It's a kind of slightly irritating satirical news programme. But this was an exchange with the even more irritating, including even more irritating chick-lit author turned Tory MP Louise Mensch. And it was an exchange about the Occupy London stock exchange. And I think it's kind of symptomatically interesting and will sort of lead into the kind of topic that I want to deal with today. Okay, so about 4 minutes. Maybe you won't watch it all, but just to get the gist of it. You don't want to hear about that. It's another whole miserable aspect of Britain which we can leave aside for the moment. Okay, now, sort of what interests me about that really is, can we so easily dismiss Louise Mensch's point here? Or rather, why does it seem to make sense when Louise Mensch says, well, anti-capitalists, how can they be on Twitter? How can they be having iPhones? How can they be, how can they be in Starbucks? So being in Starbucks seems to make more sense. Although at the end, I want to move around and say, even the design for Starbucks is nothing to do with the design for capitalism, actually. But why attack on iPhones, as it were? Why does that seem to make sense? Why has anti-capitalism been associated with this kind of anarcho-primitivism, really? Now, of course, as we saw there, she was ridiculed. But I mean, this kind of critique that she's making there, it just wouldn't have made much sense, I don't think, in the time of the Cold War, let's say. This association of sort of anti-capitalism or opposition to capitalism with anti-technology. That's but at the time of the Cold War, the space race, etc. That association wasn't made. So it's something to do with, at least on the implicit and perhaps disavowed level, of political aesthetics of anti-capitalism, which at least implies this opposition to kind of technology and to modernity. And I want to suggest that is really a serious problem, actually, and that what Mensch is saying is maybe what a lot of other people think, and maybe why a lot of other people, and I think particularly working class people, have problems with anti-capitalism. So even if they may support a lot of the aims of anti-capitalism, even though for instance, they share the anger against banks, but nevertheless there's a certain reticence in being associated with anti-capitalism, and that's because of this idea. It's partly because of this idea, I think, that being an anti-capitalist means you'll have to revert to a barter system, be living in a tent. be reduced to face-to-face interaction, grow sort of rotting organic vegetables and all of that, and that's what life will be. In other words, you have to repudiate, you have to throw your mobile phones away at the door and abandon all hope, of ever getting them back. And I really think that it's really important that we articulate an opposition to this, and start to really say, well, what does post-capitalism involve actually? And I think that might partly involve then a shift away from anti-capitalism and the associations of anti-capitalism towards this concept of post-capitalism. And I think this is partly about reasserting them in lots of ways a kind of a traditional Marxism, in a way, with its idea of technocracy, of maximising productive potential, of planning, and of mass production, and certain notions of management, actually. Okay, let's take a step back then, because I think whilst I say unequivocally support things like the Occupy movement. I mean, it's unequivocally positive that it's happened. So what I'm saying is really, I think, about something supplementary rather than something that is necessarily critical of it. I mean, it's good that it's opened up, a space for critique, and which is in excess of, marches or protests, which are time limited and sort of easily contained, and as treated as a kind of background noise, really, and life can easily return to normal. But the sheer persistence of occupations means that they can have a different role, I think, than that. And as I think Owen Jones has sort of forcefully argued, one of the most powerful things about the Occupy movement is it refocuses attention. That the ruling class has made a sort of desperate attempts to blame the crisis on public spending, instead of what we all know to be the real cause, which was the financial system, as we all know, and Occupy as by publicly reiterating what we all know, then that has a kind of ritualistic power in itself against the kind of the fact that we're told things that we don't believe, repeatedly told things that we don't believe. I mean that is what power can do. It can make something the official truth, even though nobody actually believes it. And it's the Occupy. At the very least, has cracked that ability to push that untruth as the kind of official narrative. But I think that doesn't mean that there aren't problems with it, or that there aren't problems with it if nothing else happens. Actually, okay. And I think one of the problems with it is it doesn't really break from what I've called capitalist realism. Capitalist realism, I've been interviewed many times about capitalist realism and really know better at defining it than when I first started sort of thinking about it, really. But the capitalist realism, I think, is something that is easy to identify, but it's not so easy to define. Partly because of its cloud-like or sort of mist-like kind of amorphousness, and also the fact that we're still very much, I think, in the middle of it. I mean, one way of thinking about capitalist realism would be that it was a belief. It was a belief, the belief that capitalism is the only viable system, that everything else, it might be nice, but it's unrealistic. It doesn't really work, etc. But another way of thinking about it is that it's an attitude, really, an attitude of kind of resignation in response to the above. That we might like things to be different from what they are, but we can't really change them. that isn't then so much a judgment about how good capitalism is as a system, how effective it is. It's more a judgment about the balance of forces in the world today. That, you know, the forces are with capital, and that really all we can do is adjust to that and sort of adapt to a world completely dominated by capital. But part of the problem of thinking about capitalist realism in those terms is that, you know, that they're kind of individual psychological categories, and really that I think what we're talking about with capitalist realism is more than that. It's something that can be extrapolated out of individual psychological kind of dispositions, and what we're talking about is more diffuse, a kind of ideological atmosphere or psychic infrastructure, I think. And you know, involved in that is a number of ideas, such as that, you know, the state is inefficient and oppressive. There's a kind of disdain for planning and top-down organisation. There's nothing worse than a top-down in this kind of thinking. And there's also a kind of negative identification of that, or negative connotation of anything to do with the public. That, you know, the public is thought of as something fusty, archaic, and obsolete. And you know, by comparison with anything to do with the state, with planning, or the public, you know, the private sector clearly then appears as something as dynamic, exciting, new. And what's involved in this is a temporality, control of time, where the concept of modernisation becomes equivalent to the concept of neoliberalisation, where, you know, they are practically used synonymously. To modernise means precisely to adapt to conditions of kind of dominion of capital, and with the effect that it seems that no other modernity is possible, which I think takes us back to this kind of Louise Mensch kind of symptomatic attitude that. Any kind of resistance to capital, any kind of alternative to capitalism would be one that would essentially be going backwards in time, and sometimes very far back in time, to primitive conditions almost. That's partly what I mean by the extent to which, at least at an implicit level, at the level of political aesthetics, the Occupy movement in danger of supporting this idea that there's nothing in the future there's nothing in the future except capital. That really capital has the control of modernity and everything that will come after that, and all we can do is wind back in time. And you know, I think it's very important that that we have a counter-argument to that, really. In addition to these kind of beliefs, attitudes, psychic infrastructure, I mean, what we're also talking about desire here, and you know, questions of libido, and you know, it's very significant that she talks about the iPhone, of course. People might remember the famous Apple advert from 1984. You know, very much playing on the year in which it came out, with, you know, Apple computers as associated with a kind of breakthrough of a kind of individuality, as opposed to the kind of totalitarian monoliths, a kind of totalitarian monolithic culture. And you know, something like the iPhone, of course, now, you know, is very much an emblem of this idea of capital as the deliverer of modernity, and also as the liberator of desire. And you know, this is what is also behind Mensch's claim, isn't it? That really capital has a monopoly on desire in lots of ways. That what is offered by anti-capitalism, well, only a kind of staunching of desire, a blocking of desire. You know, and what she's also saying is, you know, that's why it's not realistic. That's not why it's realistic, because even these people who claim they're opposed to capitalism, the desires which capital and only capital can engage with, are too strong for them. After a while, after a few hours or days of being in their tents, they have to go into Starbucks to imbibe the wonders of capital. And even when they're in the tents, they're on their iPhones, which shows that the power of these desires, which will erupt everywhere. So I think this question also about desire and post-capitalism is crucial. The idea that we really have to break down this idea that there is this necessary equivalence of desire and capitalism, that only capitalism can kind of be libidinal. I think there's a little parable of all this. I don't know if you've seen Steven Spielberg's film The Terminal. It's a film I have to think about because I spent quite a lot of time in airports now. It's not a very good film, but it's quite interesting, symptomatic film. In the film, if you've seen it, you may know Tom Hanks is playing someone from a sort of fictional East European country, and while his plane is flying over to New York, this country seems to happen really quickly. The country is engaged in some sort of civil war. It collapses. He loses his kind of citizenship, and so he has to stay in JFK Airport in the terminal period. As an example of the sort of capitalist realism on lots of levels, that you couldn't do better than the terminal, partly in the sense that what signifies of realism in the terminal. Signifies of realism in the terminal are franchise chain stores. The names of kind of corporate logos, the sigils of kind of corporate power. What's interesting about that is it's actually not realistic. If you've been to JFK, it looks like a kind of shoddy sort of Soviet airport almost. There's hardly any kind of franchise stores there actually. But it's interesting that in order to make it seem like a realistic airport, they had to build another airport. They had to build an airport on a lot, full of corporate kind of signs, etc. Of course, what is interesting about the film is the underlying fantasy. The fantasy is that if only Hanks could get out of the airport, that he could get to a place that was different from the airport. If only he could get to the real America. Well, as if the real America was going to be anything different from this completely corporate-dominated environment. I mean, as it were, that Hanks is already in the middle of the reality of capitalism, and he's right in the middle of it because he's a kind of precarious worker. He has to pick up bits and scraps of work around the airport on a very temporary and casual basis, with no sense of security or permanence. He's right. He's already being in the airport. He couldn't be more in the centre of kind of late capitalism. There's no need to go anywhere else, and actually there's nowhere else to go anyway. So I think part of the response to this kind of Louise Mensch type aggressive capitalist realism, there's no alternative, but even they want it. I mean, part of the response to that is to dystopianize now, actually, to realise the extent to which we're already living in the middle of a kind of even before the capitalism collapses even further than it is now, and it surely is going to collapse. Levels down, and who knows where that will end up. But even before all that we live in this kind of that we're already living in a kind of dystopia, a dystopia in which far from as it were liberating desire, things like iPhones play a major part in tethering us. That objects like iPhones, smartphones, Blackberries are not simply there as consumer objects to be enjoyed. I mean, I guess what's interesting actually about iPhones, is a similar kind of thing came up with the riots in the summer, where reactionaries were arguing that these people can't be poor. The rioters can't be poor because they've got BlackBerries. You know, they've got BlackBerries, that means they're not poor. Well, I mean, it's as if somehow that smartphones were luxury items. I mean, smartphones simply are not luxury items anymore. They are the means of connection to cumulative capitalism. They're the means of they're no more luxury item for us than lathes were in a sort of the high day of kind of industrial capitalism. That, you know, they are the means by which capital can connect with us. That precarious work, etc., cannot be done unless we have things like mobile phones, where we're contactable at any moment. And the dystopian dimension of this, I think, you know, that we need to just take a step back from where we are and maybe look at things just as an instructive, just for instructive purposes, not because we should be nostalgic. But, you know, think about how different things were even 10 years ago. You know, if you go into the centre of London now, it does look like you're in a fairly cheap B-movie science fiction film in which everyone's hypnotised by screens. You know, you could have, there were sort of, you know, Doctor Who stories like this. You know, and they come, oh yeah, this kind of, that's not really plausible. But now we're in the middle of it. You know, you were looking at people who were, you know, entirely entranced by screens. And it's not like I'm saying this like I'm immune to this at all. Like, of course not. Like, you know, it's practically a requirement that we be plugged into this cyberspace architecture at all times. But this is not simply a matter of enjoyment, desire. It's the fusion really of the demands of work with libido that makes this network so pernicious. That's why it's so difficult to unplug from the sorts of networks of communicative capitalism, because the smartphone is both an object of enjoyment and both the means by which the demands are placed on us by work. That's part of the reason for its power over us, actually. And surely what would be involved then in thinking about, you know, what post-capitalism might be like. It's not then the idea of, okay, let's throw smartphones away, let's go back to face-to-face interaction, let's go back to living in villages, you know, where we don't have the internet, etc. It's more about thinking, not about the technology per se, but the kind of the social relations, the different patterns of work, etc. that might surround these technologies. The ways in which these technologies could function differently in different kind of social political contexts. So I think we don't want, we really have to think very clearly then about how we're going to articulate alternatives to capitalism that are not involving this any kind of model of retreat into a prelapsarian past, a rejection of technology, a rejection of the achievements of modernity. And I think one way of tackling the sort of the kind of position presented by Mitch, which I say, as I say, it's not like it's something she's just cooked up, or it's just some silly error of her part. I think the critique is symptomatic. One way of doing that is really to, instead of thinking that capital is now satisfying that capital is satisfying the desires which it gives rise to, is to say the opposite actually. that capitals are everywhere thwarting desires, not meeting them. And that actually the post-capitalist world is the world where desires can actually be satisfied more radically. So let's take the bull by the horns and take the actual Starbucks example here. Since, as it was, Starbucks seems to be the very sort of emblem of capitalist dominion. The fact that it replicates so successfully that, as Louise Mensch says, even anti-capitalists go there. Well, isn't actually Starbucks, though, a kind of classic case of dialectical ambivalence? Dialectical ambivalence, I think that, as it were, we should have dialectical ambivalence about Starbucks. And isn't it the case, actually, that the customers of Starbucks, which may include us at some times, also share dialectical ambivalence about it? Like many of the most successful features of late capitalism, it's really often the people who most use these things are also most critical of them. So I think that's the other side of it, actually. The fact that anti-capitalists going to Starbucks doesn't undermine their points any more than that the fact that people who go to Starbucks sort of hate Starbucks also. And okay, so one of the things we can note about Starbucks, isn't it, is the way in which the criticisms of Starbucks, which, as I say, are often made by the people who use Starbucks as much as those who don't, uncannily echo the kind of criticisms of state communism. So Starbucks is generic, it's homogenous, it's standardized, it crushes out individuality. Hold on. So how could it? Isn't it strange that this emblem of capitalism and freedom suddenly ends up sounding exactly like what people said about Stalinism? That's kind of peculiar. Well, I think we should be positive about this and say really then that this shows that the desire for Starbucks is the thwarted desire for communism. Really. And no, I'm not just being facile about it. I mean it. In the sense that, what do people want from Starbucks? Okay, what do people want from it? The desire involved in going to Starbucks has nothing to do with coffee, I hope, Jesus. The people don't like the coffee, right? It's nothing to do with Starbucks, any more to do with the admiration for capital or the capitalist system, really. And really, as people have said, the desire for Starbucks is fundamentally tied up with the desire for what is called the third place, not work, not home. And what is this space if not a public space, actually? And so what you get in Starbucks is a degraded form of public space, if the success of Starbucks tells us anything, then is that the desire for public space has not withered away, despite the intense kind of program of kind of PR de-dividendization aimed at the concept of the public under the period of kind of capitalist realist dominion, really. And so, the question is to really go with this. If people want the generic, the homogeneous, and the standardized, can't we imagine much better versions of the generic and the homogeneous and standardized than Starbucks provides, actually? And shouldn't part of what post-capitalism be about is delivering this? And you can say, look, we can get you a much better designed space than Starbucks. You pay a little bit more on your tax. You don't even, you can go in for free. You don't even have to drink the rubbish coffee either, as it were. I think really that what we can see in a lot of that kind of what we can see is a lot of capitalist infrastructure is this kind of thwarted desire for communism, for collectivization. I was in Westfield Shopping Centre the other day, which is the new shopping centre that's been built for the Olympics. We won't go into the Olympics either. well, I will go into Olympics at length if you want, but major causes of misery and rage in Britain at the moment. You know, Westfield Shopping. You just have to flash on Westfield Shopping Centre with your dystopian post-capitalist eye, and you see it looks like it just looks like the most dismal form of kind of bad collectivism. It looks like a really bad kibbutz. These kind of cavernous hangars where people are required to sort of eat together. You know, and this is supposed to be a place of intense enjoyment and kind of capitalist self-fulfillment. It just looks like some collective eating hall. And if people want that, let's give them that in a better form, actually. What I think is sort of crucial then in overcoming elements of capitalist realism is really a return to certain concepts that you know, that were used disdainfully originally, such as designer socialism. You know, designer socialism was a term that was used to, you know, ridicule people, really. The idea that, again, I think was the same kind of thinking as behind Mensch's kind of dismissal, but there are these socialists who into kind of design, etc. But why shouldn't socialists be into design? And actually, couldn't one say very clearly that at the time of defeat of the left is very much tied up with that kind of the disassociation of leftism from good design. That, you know, the idea that again that capital is the word designer is synonymous with with capitalism. You know, this is a lot of the origins of the problems of the left lie in this kind of equivocation here. And another one, radical chic. Again, a notion that was originally kind of satirical, but you know, the association of the fashionable with, you know, the fashionable with the left, etc. What is the problem here? You know, I do think we have to. I do think, on the contrary, this being a problem, this is something we need to cultivate. You know, we need to compete on a sort of libidinal terrain of modernity. To compete, not adapt to it, but to change it. And you know, offering people a choice between, you know, either if you're saying to them, well, look, you can either have your supermarkets and your iPhones, or you can come in tents with us. You know, I think it's offering a sort of bad choice, really, and it's a choice that no one should be required to make, actually. But I mean, I think what's crucial here is that we need, if we want, if we want this kind of post-capitalist conception of the public, I think we then need a new concept of the public, where the public is not simply thought of as equivalent to the state. Now, I'm not there saying that the state should play no role in the public and the generation of the public. Because I think part of the problem with some of the neo-anarchist currents that are circulating around the Occupy movement is there is a slide from anti-statism into anti-politics altogether, where, you know, an opposition to the state becomes very quickly becomes a sort of recommendation to retreat from kind of any kind of model of systemic change. And I think that itself is a symptom of capitalist realism, as it were. The idea that, I mean, direct action, I think, doesn't come out of, in most cases, doesn't come out of a feeling of empowerment, but a feeling of disempowerment, actually. The sense that, well, we have to do something ourselves now, immediately, comes out of a feeling that there's no possibility for us to change things in an indirect, but sort of more long-term and systemic way. the question of the state won't go away. That it's not as if, if we retreat from the state, that the state then will sort of just wither away. Quite clearly, neoliberalism that requires the state in order to operate, and it's quite happy with us to back away and say, well, you can have the state. Which isn't to say that those kind of old 20th century models of taking over the state are quite adequate now. But it's to say that the state continues to be a powerful actor and must be part of any kind of any political program that actually wants to change things in any sustainable and long-term way. It must have some kind of relationship to the state. But equally, that's the public is not the public is not the same as the state, and we need to have a sort of modernised concept of the public, and indeed argue that really the concept of the public is in a way synonymous with modernity. That I think we need to partly have to battle over the question of temporality and defeat neoliberal temporality. As I was saying, neoliberal temporality, the argument is history goes in one direction, capitals, and that inevitably ends up in privatisation, etc., as the end stage. Well, I think we need a kind of different model, and a return to this concept of enlightenment and progress, actually. And the idea that really that the achievement of a public sphere was a production of modernity, which has been interrupted and kind of retarded by this period of kind of neoliberal barbarism, actually. Dan Hind's work, actually, Dan Hind's book, Return of the Public, is very good on ways of refurbishing the concept of the public. Hind wanting to move beyond kind of this idea of the state as this kind of in this neoliberal caricature, really, as being this top-down centralizer, and has the idea of public commissioning. In terms of media and funding of science, I have two examples which he gives. He says that, in a way, there's a lot of rhetoric of, there's an enormous amount of rhetoric of participation and involvement in late capitalism. Corporations want us to join the debate. I wouldn't join any debate that corporations would ask you to join in personally. But I mean, I think this in itself is another example of a kind of the thwarted desires, the desires that capitalism sort of feeds but can't itself satisfy. The desire for people to have more control over the institutions that determine their lives. But this simply, obviously, cannot be done at the level of kind of consumer incapacitivity. But what Dan Hind suggests is, instead of this model of kind of consumerism, we can have a model of the public becoming the commissioner of things. So that, for instance, with the media, which, to say the least, is in just a little bit of crisis at the moment in the UK in particular. But with the media, there could be a system where the public itself could be in control of commissioning investigative journalists. And he sort of costed it out, how much it would cost in order to have this system where you have 200 or so investigative journalists who had to sort of pitch their projects to a committee of the public, and then the public would decide who to fund. Now, I think one's immediate response to this, or one of the responses one might have to this is, well, wouldn't people just fund like stories about celebrities and all of that? Well, I think that itself is a kind of symptom of kind of capitalist realist defeatism actually people when people in a position of actively being responsible for commissioning something, and it's their project. And they have a stake in a project. It's very different from when they are consumers, when they can, as it were, disavow the way in which the thing has been produced. I think Dan Hanley is right to bet on, or sort of wager on the fact that in those conditions where the public could choose what kind of stories were being written, that they would make, good and informed choices, as it were. And he makes the same kind of argument for funding of science. Because, of course, at the moment what we see of both of these things is behind an ostensibly egalitarian rhetoric is the reality of the domination of the media by the media and sort of science research in universities, the domination of those things by corporate and military interests. And I do think that media is crucial, as it were. And I think this is one other dimension of this this question of political aesthetics. One often hears in some of the neo-anarchist kind of discourse, a kind of disdain for mainstream media. But I think the whole lesson of cultural studies really is that there is no such thing as mainstream media as a monolith. That the mainstream media is really a terrain that can be fought over. Certainly in a sort of modern society like ours, that the idea of a kind of ordinary street life or whatever that is beyond the media is extremely naive. That the media saturates everything, and that just as if we give up on the state, if we give up on the state, others will control it. And if we give up on mainstream media, then other forces will continue to control it at the moment. The lesson of if one actually looks at the history of the mainstream media is a story of terrain won and terrain lost. And you certainly won't win any terrain if you're not fighting for it. It's part of a kind of healthy public sphere must be a kind of a better media. And I think sort of Dan Hines' proposals are sort of one way of achieving that. But my broad point then is this question of re-libidinizing the public, re-libidinizing, refurbishing the public. That all of the dark arts of kind of capitalist PR have been used against the concept of the public, and to disassociate the public, any notion of the public with notions of anything kind of desirable. But I think the task now is to break out of this binary and to imagine the two fused. Imagine a kind of a post-capitalist libido and a public world that was fused with desire. And crucially, then, this does involve this return to questions of the designer, I think, as I was saying earlier. So the task of reclaiming modernity, I think, then, is a task that involves taking on some of the things which are implicitly or explicitly disavowed, I think, by the sort of neo-anarchist currents that surround the Occupy movement. So it does involve talking about management, planning, bureaucracy, and actually authority. That's, as we've seen, I mean, as I talk about in my book, Capitalist Realism, that one of the myths of neoliberalism is that bureaucracy was a thing of the past. And what we actually find is that bureaucracy has shifted form. Bureaucracy is yes, no longer associated with a kind of, no longer simply associated with a kind of centralized state authority, but bureaucracy is then instead proliferated into all areas of work and life. So that instead of being subject to bureaucratic judgment from others, we ourselves become the auditors of our own life and work. And the question then isn't simply, well, do we imagine a world free of bureaucracy altogether? But it's of what kind of bureaucracy do we need? What kind of bureaucracy, would we want in a world where things worked better? Same with a question of management. If it's not a question of assuming that we can do without management in a kind of modern, complex, globalized world, but the issue is not all management has to be managerialism of neoliberalism, a kind of cancerous, kind of metastatizing model of management, which is actually sort of stifles initiative and becomes self-defeating. But also the question of authority, I think, is a kind of a crucial one. I think one of the key questions, really and the key problems that emerged since the 60s was the question of what an anti-authoritarian left would look like. As the kind of discontent with Stalinism became generalized, there was a search for an anti-authoritarian left. And the popular story is then that this was this failed actually. That what happened was as soon as you moved away from the authoritarian structures of the old Stalinist left, as soon as the left kind of pluralized into different struggles over sexuality, ethnicity, gender, etc., then it no longer had the kind of hegemonic force that it was able to command in its heyday. Therefore, in a certain way, in giving up authoritarianism, it sort of gave up any question of sort of power. But I think that's a sort of a pessimistic judgment, and that really partly how we deal with this is not to walk away from the question of authority, but to precisely argue that proper authority is inherently anti-authoritarian. That the way in which we achieve a kind of anti-authoritarian politics is by constituting authority collectively, not by dispensing with the question of authority altogether. And as we see with many of these movements which try and avoid the question of authority, it's not that they get rid of authority. It's that it keeps coming back in different forms. And so I think central to the next phase of the struggle really is to think about collective forms of authority and how they might be constituted. Okay, I think I've said enough for now. I'll leave it there for just take it.
Thank you, Mark. So please, questions, comments.
Do you currently now, this process of see a society or a country, state, something in all world, not just in Europe, that's maybe most similar to post-capitalism?
Good question.
To your opinion, do you see something which is most similar?
No. No, but I don't think that means that that things are hopeless.
No, just
but it's just that I think since in a way, like I think part of the point what I'm saying is that things are in a way close to it, but they're this dystopian version of. So in a way, the most capitalistic societies have the potential, are in a way the dystopian model of what could be post-capitalism, as it were. So I don't know. It's kind of it's difficult, that one, because.
Yeah, because I was wondering, because today I was reading an article and something about our neighbor state Slovenia. They have also elections in December, and there is some weird stuff going on which we don't actually know. That just in 1 month, there is formed a new party called the Party for Changes, and they are appealing that the capitalism system has to change. They're the second party already. Just in a month, they're a new party, and just in a month they get, according to polls, the second party, which will enter the parliament. So that's a little bit interesting.
Yeah.
That they don't have a real agenda. It's just that they think that people should more enroll in that kind of stuff, more in economics. That they should, the whole nation, they should. Decide what should they do, in which way, what's the best for them, and that kind of stuff. So
maybe it's a bluff.
What?
Maybe it's a bluff.
A bluff in that way.
I don't know. I mean, Slovenians have a weird capitalistic history, so maybe it's not.
Well, I mean, my general sense is there's a kind of void in mainstream politics, so-called mainstream politics, really. That there's a gap, really. So we've got people on the streets. But we've got complete paralysis at the level of mainstream politics, and there doesn't seem to be any way of connecting the two at the moment. But that seems to me the job, as it were, that that might involve repopulating existing parties or creating new ones. I mean, I think we have to be imaginative at this point, because. Everything's up for grabs in a way it just hasn't been, certainly for the last 30 years. I mean, the point about capitalist realism is that in a way it was true that there's no realistic resistance to capital possible over the last 30 years. I think its victory was so overdetermined on so many fronts during that period. But now things are just radically open. We just don't know. We just don't know what's going to happen, and quite clearly politicians have lost a grip. Quite clearly the capitalists have lost a grip. Nobody has a grip. I mind of that line from Nick Lander that if someone can impersonate a pilot, it will be a comfort to the other passengers. I mean that's the situation that we're in at the moment, isn't it? Quite no one driving, no one, and all of the things that were. Made neoliberalism powerful, i.e. politicians are a kind of inert, unthinking kind of mechanisms just to ensure that the flow of capital. Now that's completely dysfunctional, because you actually need politicians who could think and act decisively, and that they're simply plainly not capable of that, nor capable of acts of imagination. And so we're in a state of total vacuum and desert. That neoliberalism is discredited, which doesn't mean that it's going to die. Discredited things can took 400 years for the Roman Empire to die. Whatever. So just because it's discredited, doesn't mean it'll fall away. But I mean, it does mean that there is this ideological junkyard, desert, which can be repopulated, I think. So did you want to come?
Well, I had just a few comments. Enjoyed your talk very much. Let me see what's the top. Okay, one thing. I mean, I live between London and Zagreb, so I wasn't there for the most recent Occupy meeting. I just managed to visit them one afternoon, and I had the sense, incredibly optimistic sense, that what seemed to be happening was a kind of push towards reformism rather than revolutionary. And I would just like to get your feeling about, because I do have a notion that there has been a paradigm shift in the public sphere, one that might not be the kind of radical politics that many would have hoped for, but one that has a very kind of a potential for reform. I happened to be there when I think it was George Irvin was doing a lecture on Plan B for Britain, a different kind of economic package. And the other thing that, I don't know whether it's connected or not, but it seems to me that, if the mainstream media in the UK and all over Europe now has actually started using the word capitalism.
Yes.
It didn't use before.
Right.
So it's become a marked noun rather than, in that sense, I think there is a crack in the idea of the real.
No, absolutely right. I think that the capitalist realism is most powerful when it's not seen at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, as soon as it was named, the point at which it could be named was the point at which it was already weakening.
Yeah.
Because it ceased to be a natural field of assumptions or a quasi-natural field of assumptions and became a kind of, revealed to be a set of kind of ideological impositions, as it were. And that, you're right, that's filtering through. That's what I mean about there is no such thing as mainstream media in the sense of something which is absolutely fixed and monolithic in what it's doing. It's really noticeable actually after the Occupy thing in the States, how different the coverage of the Occupy thing in the UK was. It was the residual hegemonic power of the US really, where as part of that I think, if Americans are doing it, it's okay. But we did see even on things like Murdoch owns Sky News, surprisingly equivocal, verging on positive coverage of the Occupy London movement. And I think if nothing else, in the context of the US, if nothing else, it achieves this kind of hegemonic rebalancing. But the impression you've got with the Tea Party in the US was that all of the kind of extra, all of the kind of political forces outside of the electoral system were right wing, and that obviously pulls them. That kind of stabilises a kind of so-called centre ground, which is massively to the right anyway. Whereas I think that what we're seeing with Occupy is a kind of focus for a focus for hegemonic shift. But I think you have to believe in things like hegemony. You have to believe in things like media in order for that to be important. And what I'm saying is some of the rhetoric around, some of the sort of neo-anarchist rhetoric around Occupy would disdain both of those things. They don't think that they're important. That what is important is some kind of face-to-face localism or whatever. And for me, in spite of all that, it actually is in its interventions in media terrain, and the BBC economics editor Paul Mason has referred to Occupy as a brand. And I think that you can imagine many people involved in bristling at that. But I think that is a mark of its success. That it is a highly successful kind of meme that can spread even through the hostile terrain of capitalism. Sorry, you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, in search of this post-capitalist paradigm, and when somebody asks you if you know of any state that's similar to it, what do you compare it to? I mean, those candidate states. Is there anything you can, some paradigm that basically gives you a mattress against which you...
Something like Iceland?
No, I don't mean a negative comparison, but actually a positive comparison. when you are asked if there is some...
What do you mean by positive comparison then?
Meaning that not a mismatch with capitalism, but an actually positive match with some criteria. Are there any criteria that actually give you some guidelines towards what the post-capitalist system or a reformed capitalist system should be? Besides just the things that, you know, the obvious effects of capitalist realism.
Okay. Well, it would be one in which, you know, at a simple level, capital was subdued, and capital wasn't dominating the country. You know, where there was, where capitalism wasn't dominating the country, but there was, there were all the achievements of technological modernity, where there was a sort of strong public sphere, where people's lives weren't dominated by work they didn't want to do, where there was some kind of security, people were not in conditions of constant precariousness, where, for instance, cultural work was could be rewarded in an adequate way. You know, these are some of the features of what a post-capitalist society would look like.
So capitalist dystopia, it sounds like capitalist utopia.
Well, why is it capitalist though?
Well, because it, you know, okay, maybe that's a good response.
No, what are you saying is what makes capitalism capitalism then?
But you still retain, you know, like most of those, how do I say, fruits of capitalism. You tend to go after them to still retain them, just flush the capitalism.
Well, I don't know what's capitalist. That's what I'm trying to say about the whole thing. What is capitalistic about them, though? I mean, okay, let's. I mean, for instance, I mean, surely at a simple level, capitalism means the domination of capital over workers. I mean, so what about what I just said is capitalist in that sense?
You forget to mention the social ownership of the means of production.
Okay, I mean that's okay. There's a kind of give like that, I suppose, in the sense that it's, you know, how do we stop capital dominating over? It's the preconditions, all of those things, isn't it? That, I mean, how do we stop capital dominating all areas of life? How do we achieve any of those things without some model of public ownership? But there is public ownership, I think, rather than this old model of the state running everything. Like the state would have to, like I say, the state would have to play some role in it. But that social ownership, then I prefer that term to notion of the state run, actually.
I mean, I will refer back to Slovenia. I know you hate it, but when they started to sell their companies, beginning of the 90s, from the fall of Yugoslavia, everything was state-owned and everything. They had a really excellent system. Every company and everything was actually given to the citizens. And then they were the owners, and they were selling among themselves shares and actually...
That's not right. We have public ownership and then we have of shares to workers, which is...
Yeah, but Slovenians sell to tycoons. Slovenians didn't sell to tycoons. You have still companies who are actually citizen or state-owned. They're like, health insurance is owned by the citizens. If you have a health insurance, then you're also an owner. So you will pay money for your shares and you will get insurance, something like that.
But how's that not privatisation?
I don't know.
I mean,
It's privatized, but per individual.
Share on.
yeah.
I think that it's kind of an ironic twist that petty consumerism should become the test of failed anti-capitalist attitude when it's actually the grand consumerism of capitalism that has triggered, or the failure of the grand consumerism of the capitalism that has triggered the current crisis, that is the housing bubble. So maybe instead of just like thinking in terms of libidinal attachments to mobile phones and coffees, we should start advocating libidinal attachments to housing and work, which is a definite limit to the capacity, the current capacity of global capitalism. And that immediately leads us to the question of how do we provision those kinds of goods to the collective desire for them.
No, I think that's
I mean, if we want to twist around things, or if we want to play with the notion of consumerism, we should advocate that. Just like think big. The biggest thing. Everybody should have a villa. Please try to provide that. That's the public system that we need.
No, I agree. But I think that the point is about that. The point about Starbucks is not about consumerism, though. That it only seems to be about that. That it's actually about desire for a certain kind of space, etc. Which is, and that's. So I don't think it is about petty consumerism at all. But I agree with you. I agree with you that obviously that is part of the question of libidinizing the public. Would be countering the massive delibidinization of social housing, etc. You know, even though that. Well, there's a massive delibidinization program against social housing, but now, as we were discussing earlier, it costs £250,000 to get a flat in a former council house block in London. So that you get the worst of all worlds, actually, in some ways. But you know, I mean, you know, that is part of the project. I think would be exactly that. You know, making social housing desirable. And I do agree about work as well. You know, a lot of the focus on in late capitalist societies is on the consolations that one gets outside work, given that work itself is accepted as being miserable, and that's part of a kind of privatization of everyday life. That you know, since where we're spending most of our life, albeit in some debased public form, work is always to some extent public, and you know that is where we are most miserable, and you know the consolations for that are to be found in the private space, but instead, you know, refocusing on the work idea, and which would then refocus people's demands in respect of work. I think. The reason that people, part of the reason that people accept poor conditions in work is that that isn't where the focus of their lives is, or they don't expect it to be there. So no, I agree on both points. Absolutely.
I think that maybe the point would be, like a more serious point would be how do you create public imaginary and public desire for transitions that, for instance, David Harvey desires for capitalism, like give people a chance for normal living and take care of the environmental impact, and then you're basically moving toward a transition of capitalism. You need to kind of start from the systematic makeup of capitalism and try to think how do you break up that, but rather how do you create pressure on the system to start transforming in that direction, and then lead it into well, maybe an impasse where it has to change, or rather where it transforms successfully, or I don't know.
No, I agree. It's about creating a public imaginary. but that involves competing on this terrain of Leviathan engineering, I think. You know, that it involves making things desirable. It involves making people think that a public sphere is desirable. Not accepting this binary where we're the kind of on the side of kind of dreary ethical worthiness versus, you know, exciting, glossy capitalism. We have to both say that this, you know, this new kind of publicly owned culture would be more exciting and desirable, and that, you know, the ostensible gloss and fizz and effervescence of capitalism is actually miserable. You know, surely both at the same time.
Maybe I just wanted also to come up to David Harvey. It's always struck me seeing Harvey as you have a geographer who is always so tentative about the spatial emergence of neoliberalisms, which are always for him in plural. But then when he comes to talk about the libido, which has been captured by neoliberalism, he always takes it as a kind of uniform. So it's interesting, so there is no geography of libido in Harvey. So now come to my point. So, but now, also to your comment as a kind of comment or provocation for your lecture. So if you look up into history of social struggle from the 60s in Europe up until now, I could say, okay, you have a kind of story which is kind of Anglophone, which is UK based. But then everything you have told me reminded me everything about like the German or the French way of the long march through the institution after '68.
Yeah.
And then of course you have the geography of the socialist states like Central European or Eastern European. So my question now would be, now everything you have told me or you have told us, how does it differ from the program of the long march through the institution, like has been at least imperative for the French or the German or for the Benelux or for the Scandinavians intellectuals from the 60s on? How much? So does it differ, or is it just you now coming to terms with it?
It might differ, it might not. But I think that okay, I'll take from the Anglophone perspective. I think so. The Anglophone story will be okay. So we had the '60s. That went wrong, and that went wrong, and inevitably led to rise of neoliberalism, and you know the breakup of the old left, gave the left no traction whatsoever anymore, and the only way that was going to end up is as something like New Labour. So so you're left with an impasse of either. Capitalist realism is really about New Labour, you could say in a way. I mean, the foundations of something like New Labour, because capitalist realism is meaningless as a concept for neoliberals. Obviously, neoliberals are capitalist realists. You know that they, that's what they do. And it's really the interesting thing is about the left succumbing to capitalist realism, as it were. But then I think is that the issue is challenge of post-Fordism, and as part of this question of the anti-authoritarianism, and that's not seeing post-Fordism as just something negative, but nostalgia for Fordist conditions which allowed social democracy, etc. And be accepting that because it was driven by the desires. Post-Fordism was partly driven by the desires of workers. So that it's workers themselves who didn't want to be trapped into the kind of compact of post-Fordism, Fordism, which was boredom in exchange for security, you could say. And then it seems to me that then the problem is. Well, once you've got that, once you've got post-Fordism, once you've got the desires of workers for post-Fordism, does that automatically mean that things have to end up with capitalist realism? so I think then, I think the answer to that is no, but that does involve, I think, returning to these questions of perhaps long marches for institutions on one level, returning to some of the debates of issues raised in Italy, but autonomous in the 70s. Also returning to a lot of the issues raised in the UK by Marxism Today, the New Times Project. The New Times Project, which is historically very interesting in the UK, because a lot of the people, some of the people involved in that, went on to become the key architects of New Labour. But then there's something else involved there, I think, which was, you know, this idea of a post-Fordist leftism. I don't think the answer is sort of yes and no to your question in some sense. That it partly is a case of accepting those things that, you know, other parts of the world had accepted before. But it's not just a case of return though, since the level of intense, you know, the intensity of late capitalism in the UK, I think, just does make that difference. And also you know, the decomposition, that you're starting from this position of massive decomposition now. You're not starting from a position of where there, you know, there's an existing workers' movement which should you know, which could take a path or another. You're starting from a massively decomposed position where there is hardly any kind of effective workers' movement at all. So, you know, even if one is to learn that lesson, it's not the same kind of position that one is learning it from. I think that would be important. That would be one important difference.
Yeah, just I enjoyed very much your comments on temporality and to reclaim modernity, and maybe to connect a little bit to Peter's question, or the kind of location of the question, I guess,
Yeah.
in our geography, so here,
Yeah.
in a country that is in a so-called transition,
Yeah.
whatever we're transiting towards. I think there's probably quite a few people in this room who remember communism as it was in Yugoslavia. And I think, you know, the official rhetoric at the time of communism was that this was modern.
Yeah.
And it was in advance of the West.
Yes.
But communist realism also produced an official truth and unofficial truth. So what people knew was that we were actually backward.
Yeah.
Or what I think the common belief would have been. So just as a, you know, as a kind of addition to this kind of time traveling games, if Croatia and most of the Eastern Bloc countries are now in this kind of void of a transition towards something that's falling apart.
Yes.
This, in a way, you know, might have been articulated in the past as a lack, a kind of a lack of being, you know, or belatedness of some kind.
Yes.
But in a way, this offers an opportunity to kind of hopscotch beyond the, if you like, the kind of the appropriation of modernity by neoliberalism, I think, can be completely, possibly, what's the word?
Circumvented.
Circumvented.
Yeah.
That's the right.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
I'm sorry. What do you mean by saying that communism was ahead of capitalism?
I'm saying the official rhetoric of communism was that it was an ideology that was more advanced than capitalism.
Official rhetoric. Because technologically, of course, it wasn't. And,
yeah, well, I was saying there was a distinction between official rhetoric and common belief.
It seems to me all the talks.
But we have people who are waiting for just, you know, for questions, so maybe it's,
Yeah, okay.
we'll give a chance to everyone.
well, yeah, to come back to this question of what cultural production in Yugoslavia, because I think we have to think of historical terms of different, different times of industrial and cultural progress in Yugoslavia, and probably at some point things were more advanced than in some parts of the West, and in some point they were a bit less advanced. But we have to think of this in terms of specific economic relations between Yugoslavia and the rest of the world at a certain stage of its development or its dissolution. But what I wanted to ask you is what is specifically important for me in your speech is how do we grasp this as something as well unegalitarian as desire in a collectively egalitarian and universalizing way.
But why is desire egalitarian then?
Well, it is. I mean, desire. If you, I mean, in some specific psychoanalytical tradition, desire is something that is inherently egalitarian. It's not egalitarian in itself. There is nothing egalitarian in desire. It's always something that produces a sort of antagonism towards. I mean, it's something that is. It's never. Its direct product is never something that equalizes things, right? It produces some sort of difference and some sort of antagonism.
Well, I mean, but I think that if to take that line is really dangerous. I think. I mean, in a sense, you're back to Freud's comments on communism in Civilization and Discontent, when he says this kind of, that's his argument against it, actually, isn't it? That in a way, well, you know, questions of libido and etc. will never be resolved on this level of, but always as it disrupts, you know, any possibility of kind of achieving this kind of politically egalitarian goals. But I mean, I just think that is conservative, though. You know, I think it is a conservative model of desire in a way, and I think that, you know, the significance of the importance now of looking at things like Deleuze and Guattari, I think, for instance, is that they can, you know, they pose this question, they pose the question of the relationship between the two, and I think that if we I mean, I think, you know, the tendency has been to think of them as kind of post-Marxist or post-communist or whatever, and you know, so that leads to Zizek's idea that it's, you know, Deleuze is the ideologist of like capitalism, etc., etc. But I think that's only because of his underlying kind of comedy Stalinism, actually. Which is, you know, it would be good if the 60s hadn't happened at all. It'd be good if, you know, it'd be good if you could get rid of all these questions about desire, and you know, but you can't. And I don't think, and you know, so I think that it has to be seriously confronted. Otherwise, I think we are just feeding into capitalist realism, because what are you saying? You're going to extinguish desire, and that your political project would have involved extinguishing desire. That is what people like. That's what Louise Mensch thinks, isn't it? That, you know, that only capitalism can liberate desire. Then, and I think we have to think about ways in which actually desire is always in some sense collectively constituted. Well, isn't it true that you know, Frederick Jameson says we've never been in a world that's more collective than this one. We've never, you know, our world has never. Everything that we have is the product of so many hands, etc., etc. Yet, you know, that you know, the desire and the collective and collectivity are not necessarily opposed to one another. I think there's another question which is about. I think the deeper question, which is not necessarily deeper than yours, but alongside, but which is about you know, the relation of death drive, the relation of as it were, desire for security with the question of the death drive, as it were. Because I think that, again, part of the problem of this this implicit political aesthetics around kind of agrarianism, organicism, anarcho-primitivism, etc. An underlying fantasy of that is a world without death drive, a world of equilibrium, kind of stasis, etc. But a world in effect where desire had been extinguished. But I think that is it's both impossible and it's defeatist in a way to want to aim for that. And so for me the question is how do we reconcile the dynamism of the death drive actually with questions about security and justice. But I think to think that they are inherently antithetical, I think will only feed the idea that capitalism is the only possible way. Because capitalism is then based on precisely that idea that you can't get rid of desire, but desire is inegalitarian, and that this is the best system for managing that inegalitarianism, as it were.
My question, maybe I didn't formulate my question very well now, but what I was trying to really say, I think your tackling of the question of desire is very productive, because it takes a very strong opposition towards, on the one side, maybe a very conservative Freudian and Lacanian theory of desire, where desire is something that really is egalitarian and can only ever fail. Yeah. And on the other side, some sort of an obscurantist Reichian theory of freeing our libidinal energy, or freeing our desire, which always inevitably fails because desire is inegalitarian in a way. I mean, because it shows that desire is inegalitarian. But I think what is interesting to me in your project is really this if I understand it correctly, this point where you try to think of collectively controlling desire in an egalitarian and a very universalizing or universalist way of trying to develop a universalizing egalitarian project that also has its own material of desire.
Okay, good. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So that, another example then I think is like Disneyland. This is a classic one of why would you go to Disney? Disneyland is a totally managed environment, right? So it's this weird phenomenon of you pay to go to something which is all of the features of which are utterly disdained by the capitalist ideology around it. Do you know what I mean? So why is it really desirable for children? Because but it has all. It is a totally managed and sort of planned place. You know what I mean? It is an example of again a degraded example perhaps
but it's
of the way in which
discovered sort of.
Sorry.
It is planned, but it's also a place of discovery.
If you don't have a plan.
Like in nature.
But it's just an example, albeit a degraded one, of the way in which desire and planning, management, etc. are
It's sort of a dark side of capitalism, and it's being manipulated to keep certain people at the place of power and control. But I think the thing is that that kind of control has to be dropped in order to produce this kind of system that you're buying. And also this wasteland, where everything is perhaps sort of a primordial soup of combining all of humans on Earth consciousness through internet and communication into something that's just a sec, I sort of lost my way of thought. But just we have to perhaps it's something we have to discover and see in the process what will happen, and leave certain things structured, but also certain things free for interactive evolution.
Yeah.
In a society,
No, I agree. So it's
it's very hard for me to
it's it's a question of nobody now wants to go back to fantasy in a totally planned society. It's. But I think Jameson's really good on this. That the dialectical inversions, the way in which we've got a society where diversity, choice, etc. are massively emphasised, yet culture has never been more homogenous in like the US and the UK. And so to flip that around, it's so what are the kind of what sort of levels of standardisation, security, etc. would we need in order to produce diversity and novelty? I mean, because we have the rhetoric of diversity and novelty in late capitalism, but the reality of a massively stalled, inertial, repetitious and retrospective culture actually, and I think there's no accident that is related to the removal of social democratic security, I think. So there's no inherent opposition between kind of I hate the word creativity because of it's just the creative industries in the UK, but there's no inherent opposition between creativity and standardisation. That that's standardisation, certain kinds of bureaucracy, etc., can be precisely preconditions for creativity. And when we've definitely seen the opposite. We've definitely seen the opposite in the UK, which is a kind of lab, neoliberal experimental lab, I think, for how far things can go in terms of really removing almost any space that outside work and convalescence. I mean, that really is what that is what the UK is reduced to now. That part of the reason why the UK culture is so moribund, is simple things like this question of housing that Tom raised is really in a way the overriding factor. If you want to look at one reason why UK culture has become progressively more conservative, retrospective, you could simply look at the rise of property in a cultural hub like London. So if you want to live in London, you have to spend so much time working that you just don't have any energy or time for reflection or to kind of absorb yourself in projects. I mean, this is the key feature, I think, of kind of cyberspatial communicative capitalism, is that as Franco Berardi puts it, what you have is, from the point of view of capital, is this kind of, as it were, smooth flows, but from the point of view of workers, time is cut up. Time is cut up into these micro fragments, and you have this kind of attentional dispersal at all times. That you can't get absorbed in anything because you have to be checking what messages have come in. One hand is always on your smartphone, whatever you're trying to concentrate on. In terms of like conditions of production of art or whatever, in the broadest sense of art or art or culture, this is very bad, isn't it? That the art requires absorption, and these conditions massively militate against any kind of absorption, actually. And it's a systemic attack on this space outside business and work, and that's the real significance of the attack on funding for higher education, etc. That all of the spaces where counterculture could be built in the UK have been systematically attacked. So the spaces for spaces outside work where you could drift and become absorbed. No one has any time for that anymore, and that's because that those conditions of kind of standardization and security are removed. You don't have 3 years at university where you can be out of this time of fake urgencies. Capitalism, late capitalism, is always imposing these fake urgencies. The significance of which is just to enslave you into this constantly, this constant short-term temporality, which disables capacity for agency and kind of critical thought, I think. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Yeah, we can end here. I think
It's a very interesting discussion.
almost 2 hours here, so I think it's.
Okay.